Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Jake Williams from Rendition InfoSec. Wanted to chat a little bit today about SIM swapping attacks. This is something we keep seeing come up again and again in the news media. Unsurprising, right? Because, there have been some pretty epic, particularly in the cryptocurrency space, pretty epic hacks going on where folks are able to use that second factor of SMS to ultimately compromise an account. Obviously, big deal here. We've been preaching multi-factor authentication and security for years. I'm sure there are going to be people who are going to reply and say, but we never said SMS. And in fact, we said SMS is insecure. And there's people out there like, SMS is worse than nothing. Wow. No, that's probably not true for the majority of people, right? That's kind of like saying that a particular exercise regimen is bad because some people get hurt doing it, right? That wouldn't necessarily make the exercise regimen bad. It would depend entirely on your fitness model. Likewise here, whether or not to use SMS as a second factor depends entirely upon your threat model and on the implementation. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, Joseph Cox published something almost a week ago. Sadly, I'm a little bit late getting around to this because lots of stuff was sick earlier this week, etc. But definitely here posted a great article talking about really leveling up because prior to this, the attackers leveling up because prior to this, largely, it's been reported that some phone company employees may have been complicit in getting these, or cell phone company employees have been complicit in getting these ported, whether it was a payoff or insiders themselves directly, meaning like the actual criminals themselves might be cell phone company employees. That does not appear to be the case anymore, and in fact, we're seeing reports now of attackers breaking directly into telecom companies. And of course, I'll link this article from Joseph Cox down in the comments. Joseph mentions, and again, I highly recommend you read this, that attackers are using remote desktop software, and whether that's RDP specifically or stuff like LogMe and Rescue or any number of other tools like that, basically are using those to then break in basically break into the organizations. Okay, sucks. That is not a good thing, no question. Definitely not a good thing. Want to quickly talk about the fact that certainly here, we see an example of basically a basically the Senate inquiry here. If we come all the way down here, you'll notice that, of course, Ron Wyden, unsurprisingly, and I guess technically Senate and congressional here, but Ron Wyden, unsurprisingly, being a champion of security and privacy, asks a few key questions here and says, hey, wants to know basically, does the FCC even track these incidents? And if so, how many incidents has the FCC received? Now, why is this the FCC's responsibility? Well, of course, they set the rules around how, ultimately around how these cell phone carriers work. Of course, we know that the FCC has actually started doing a little bit about robocalling. I've seen robocalling drop off dramatically recently. I'm not saying it's dead. I'm still getting a lot of robocalls. I don't mean to say that I'm not seeing any. I'm starting to see telcos take at least some efforts to stop, or some steps to stop those ahead of some legislation there, right? So basically, they want some answers here, and I think this is a good, and of course I'll link this down here as well, below the video link here. But I think it is a positive thing that we're seeing some attempts, some interest here, not only to talk about the problem, but I do like, and this is pretty characteristic of the stuff that Wyden's involved with, and sounds like I have a little bit of a man crush. I absolutely do. I think he does phenomenal work and is a great champion for basically for safety and privacy legislation in the digital age. That said, very probing questions here. For instance, basically basically do believe that the current number porting rules are sufficient to prevent fraudulent ports. Now, when you say porting rules, what they're really talking about here is the ability to port a number port a number from one carrier to another. I like the fact that this is being asked here explicitly. I think that's a great question to start with, and then follows up with, again, can criminals use SIM swapping access or SIM swapping to access historical call records, right? So Basically, if you think about this from a carrier standpoint, I want you to picture for a moment. I'm not saying that any private investigator, certainly not any ethical private investigator, would do this. But if you wanted to recover the basically the call history of a given user, if you could successfully port that user's phone number, would that allow you to reset the account? Or reset passwords on the account, and then ultimately, control or view the historical calling information. If you think about this from a private investigation standpoint, and forget private investigation, think stalker, right? Because again, no ethical PI or PI firm, investigative firm, is going to do this, but certainly stalkers would. Another question here: does the FCC provide consumers with information on steps they can take to reduce the risk? It turns out the FTC does. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. In other countries, banks can obtain the most recent SIM swap date of a customer from their carrier to flag potentially suspicious login attempts. Now, this is fundamental to stopping fraud with SIM swaps. One of the reasons you're hearing about this a lot in the US and not so much in a number of other, at least Western/developed countries anymore, is because it's much harder to pay out or get a payout as the result of a SIM swap. The majority of these that we see the majority of the payouts are from financial institutions, trading houses, banks, etc. And this is something that we can get in a number of other countries via an API. Basically, you just simply, the bank looks and says, whoa, time out. That number literally got ported 3 minutes ago over to another carrier, and now you're requesting a reset over SMS. Yeah, I think not, right? Or merely even the multi-factor via SMS without contacting the bank and passing other basically hurdles or challenges. This is a big deal, right? What about the rules, right, for reporting illegal SIM swaps to law enforcement authorities? Now, depending on where you sit on this, you may or may not, feel like there should be a commitment for law enforcement, or basically for the carriers to provide information to law enforcement. But has FCC received reports of basically the violations of the porting rules, basically involving the hacking of other carriers and computers and retail stores, etc. Has the FCC initiated any investigations or taken enforcement actions related to these reports? Now, I have to tell you that there's good news and bad news, right? The good news is we're starting to see congressional and senatorial, action around this, right? Meaning, or interest, I shouldn't say action. This is the kind of the pre-action steps, the interest steps. And so this is huge. This is the good news. The bad news is, I'm going to tell you that from a carrier standpoint, you're likely to hear lots of, well, we can't protect everything. Now, I'd kind of argue against that, right? I would note that obviously cybersecurity is a critical issue. We know that SIM swaps are happening, and certainly we know that SIM swaps occurring are hurting a lot of folks, right? So I guess on that end, I would mention here that there is a obvious cybersecurity due diligence issue here. I would mention that if your bank, for instance, gets hacked, and your bank account gets drained, there's some liability there for the bank, right? Now, obviously, I'm not a lawyer, not providing legal advice, all those normal disclaimers, but there's some liability for the bank. Today, the liability for a SIM swap, an illegal SIM swap performed, is the liability issues for the telco or the carrier that allowed that to occur are questionable, right? So it's questionable whether or not they have basically any legal liability, and as such, if they're lacking liability, and so far that does appear to be the case by and large, right? Then there really are some questions then around, if they're lacking liability, what's their motivation, right, to fix the problem? Of course, I'm not a big regulation guy. In fact, really swing in the opposite direction there generally against regulation. But this may be a spot where we need to see some, or at least some increased accountability. That's going to start with the FCC certainly setting rules for what those carriers can and cannot do. It's no secret that I'm not a huge fan of the current FCC chairman for lots of reasons. I don't think that he's a big fan of privacy, or I think he values relationships with the commercial sector much higher than consumer privacy. And accountability there. But hey, whatever. I want to hop over here to the FTC side. and take a look at SIM swaps and how you can protect yourself. And the FTC has some good advice here. And again, I'll link this below the video. Multi-factor authentication, of course, is something that they mention here. About basically to kind of highlight why SIM swaps are actually a big deal. Obviously, a lot of MFA today, multi-factor authentication, involves SMS. Now, let's talk quickly about the question of, is multi-factor via SMS worse than basically, or via SMS only? Is that worse than nothing? And I kind of have to err on the side of no in most cases, right? Now, let me walk through why that's the case, right? In normal multi-factor authentication, right? So if it's a normal MFA, meaning you're getting basically texted a code, for instance, that you need to input into basically into a website, it is by definition that is a second factor. You've already provided a password generally by the time you get that SMS message. In most MFA schemes that involve SMS, you've already gotten that text message. You've already entered the password. That's what generates that SMS message. So an attacker that can benefit from this via SIM swap is someone that already controls your account. So there's already a fundamental security breakdown there. Where we start to run into problems is when SMS can be used to get a password reset link. This is really where the rubber meets the road, right? And so I highly recommend that before you involve SMS MFA, that you take a look at what does it take to, or what can an attacker do if they gain control of your device, right, your mobile device. And again, that could be accomplished through one of these SIM swap schemes. And so that's a spot where I highly recommend you take a look at that and go, right? So again, basically here, if there's the opportunity for a password reset link or a authenticator that relies purely on SMS, that is itself probably problematic. Now, for your average person, right? Suppose for a moment, now listen, I want to be clear actually before I go down the threat modeling side and say that if you're offered the option between SMS only, MFA, right, meaning that's the only option you have, or no multi-factor at all, are you better off with SMS or not? If you can't get a password reset link, I think without a doubt you're definitely better. If you can, you've got to weigh that risk benefit analysis there. Obviously the SMS is still a second factor, and you can take steps to protect basically to protect your SIM. I'm going to talk more about their account from being ported. Talk more about that in just a minute. Look, right off the bat, the FTC says, hey, don't reply with stuff that requests personal information. Well, no joke, right? Look, if you're watching this, you probably already know this. Don't give away your personal information. Also, again, unsurprisingly, limit the amount of personal information you share online. Okay, also, look, avoiding putting your phone number out there is probably not going to happen. Look, every day I'm drowning in data breach news, right? So there are numerous websites that require me to put a phone number in. Some of them actually text me a code to verify that, SMS me a code to verify that really is my phone number. Of course, there are websites out there that will allow you to get a temporary SMS number. I am not a fan of those, by the way, because when they need to contact you, those are public in many cases, and of course, meaning all the SMS messages that come in are public. There are tons of other security issues with that. Number 3, though, here is phenomenal. Set up a PIN on your cellular account. Now, I want to be very, very clear here that the FTC is not really trying to help you stop your SIM from getting ported. Most of the information they're talking about here is to avoid identity theft, right, and impersonation, of which SIM swapping, basically SIM swapping helps or aids in those attacks generally. But this is huge. Put a PIN or a password on a cellular account, right? Make sure that PIN or password is unique, right, and something that you can use to hopefully stop an attacker from porting your number, right? Without a password, it requires a PIN or a password requires very little. Now, I have bad news for you, and that's that if you roll back to the Joseph Cox article where we started earlier, these are attackers that are ultimately compromising, the actual cellular carrier machines that are used to do these ports and swaps. Well, okay, well now I have a separate problem, right? Because if indeed they are, basically looking at those systems, my password doesn't really matter. Obviously, this password is, or for those that don't know, the password is something that's asked to you. It's visible in the system. They purely ask you for the password and say, okay, what was your password again? Oh, your secret phrase. Okay, good. Now you can go ahead and port that number over to a different carrier. Not good, right? But certainly consider using a stronger multi-factor authentication provider. Rendition is a Duo partner. We wholly believe in Duo. I love Duo. We use it on practically everything. I've complained in the past a couple of times publicly, including on a couple of webcasts here and there, about the number of times I have to go pick up my phone in order for me to go log in to basically log in to different assets remotely, right? By the time you multi-factor, through the VPN, and then you multi-factor again to get in the ticketing system, and that says, hey, go log onto your domain account to go over here, and I'm multi-factoring like multiple times and hitting approve. Look, I'm pretty diligent about that, but we've seen in many red team exercises where people are not, and they just get used to hitting that approve button and go, right? So, hey, big fan, though, of using multi-factor outside of SMS. The unfortunate problem is that a lot of apps just still don't support that, right? So, we have, obviously, as you move down the move down the spectrum, into smaller and smaller businesses. You typically see no MFA at all. That is now, by the way, becoming a deciding factor in whether or not people, trust a particular brand. Is do they offer multi-factor? And then the follow-up there is if they do offer multi-factor, do they offer anything other than SMS, right? Some places just don't, right? For that, I highly recommend a free Google Voice phone number, right? Google maintains their own phone numbers. If you have a Google Voice phone number that you only give out in those rare cases when you can't get an SMS-based, when you can't get a basically authenticator-based multi-factor auth scheme going, it's only only SMS-based MFA. I really like this. I've recommended this to folks for years. It's what I do. You probably don't have my Google Voice number, and we're going to keep it that way, right? My regular phone number, I think, is probably pretty easy to find online. And again, that's not a challenge, by the way. I know that there are folks that have found it and have called me in the past, and great, whatever. Please don't, by the way. I won't pick up if you won't pick up if I don't recognize your number. That's kind of a thing. But hey, that said, those Google Voice numbers are great. The reason is they can't be ported, right? So it is something that can receive SMS. It doesn't get ported. Google owns that number. Right now, that brings up a whole new set of issues, right? Around, basically, do you trust Google and whatever? I'm not addressing that. I do trust Google fundamentally. Or maybe a better way to say it is if Google's hacked, the game is over, right? If somebody hacks into Google in order to compromise my Google Voice account, I'm going to throw down the gauntlet and say, stuff doesn't really matter that much anymore, meaning, a lot of my security now is security problems, again, are dead, right? We've already lost at that point. So, real quick, want to kind of wrap back through here on SIM swaps. Attackers are getting better at this, right? Now, the fact that attackers are getting better at this means that there are likely to be more victims. This used to be a much higher cost activity, meaning you had to have an insider. That insider will get found out eventually, because obviously these fraudulent SIM swaps are investigated at least internally, if not through law enforcement, and that insider will be found out very quickly. So it's not like they're going to go and by the way, criminal act, right? It's this is somebody who obviously at least in the U.S. has provided an I-9 and a bunch of other documentation there, has provided the verification for employment that goes into the I-9. Again, this is not something that's going to be an anonymous thing for long once it gets investigated. Hackers are stepping their game up, though, and that's what the Joseph Cox article really talks about. When they step up their game, you're looking at folks now basically who are hacking directly into telcos or purely into just the retail shops. And again, some of these are franchised out. The security in some of them is not really great. I was in one not too long ago where I saw an unlocked computer and there was nobody there, to stop me from typing on the computer, which is pretty crazy, right? But again, at that point, You could drop a keystroke logger on, you could, whatever the case is. Look, TLDR, there are definitely people being targeted. Definitely these organizations are being targeted. And as they are, that's going to now remove that insider component, or is already, I shouldn't say is going to, it's already removing the insider component. That's what Joseph Cox is writing about. So as that occurs, the cost to perform a SIM swap is going down, which means that there needs to be less and less payout, right? So previously, where an attacker would have looked for a very, very significant payout, like compromise a cryptocurrency account, cryptocurrency trading account, or a bank account, or you name it, where they can move a lot of money quickly, what we're really seeing now is basically is more of a commoditization of this, right? And so as a result, I would expect to see more of this. That can be both a good and a bad thing. Bad for the victims, good for advocacy, right? The more and more stories about this, the bigger the threat grows. The more victims, the more likely it is that Congress and the Senate are going to step in and force the FCC to act and enact new rules on carrier safety, as well as very likely trickle down into some liability issues there. I fully expect some liability to be attached to the telco operators, but we'll see, right? I guess at the end of the day, right? So anyway. Basically here in the short term, I highly recommend take a look at who you've given your phone number to, how widely public is that, and then for those places that you've given your phone number to, do they have do they allow to reset and recover the account via that MFA? Excuse me, via SMS MFA, if that's all they offer. And if that is all they offer, and you just can't get around that, then I highly recommend that you bounce to a voice over IP service like Google Voice, where you have numbers that are either can't be ported or are much, much, much more difficult to be ported. Anyway, enough about that. Again, man, it's amazing how often I come back and use the terms threat modeling in these videos, but that's really what it is. This really comes down to a threat modeling exercise for you, where you have to look at your own personal risk of this basically of being hit by this activity. I obviously have slightly higher risk, I would say, than some others. Just being out there a little bit. But again, I've taken a look from a threat modeling standpoint. I've moved any accounts that have purely SMS-based multi-factor auth. I've moved those over, into a Google Voice number that I do not distribute, right? And so that really helps me. I think. Pull that risk down a little bit, make that risk a little bit more manageable. Hopefully, you got something out of this as well, where you've got some ideas on talking to your executives, talking to your comptroller in particular. Huge risk there too for the comptrollers, folks who can move money around, right? So, good news, by the way, if you're thinking like, hey, I'm going to go target that guy, that is a bad plan, because you could put a gun to my head right now and I couldn't get into accounts payable. Right, meaning I absolutely could not transfer money out of Rendition to you. So I am not that guy, and in fact couldn't do it if. And this is a great separation of duties kind of thing, right? Because again, look at your threat modeling and look at who is at risk for this, and obviously you need to protect them more than others. So anyway. Enough about that. Threat modeling for the win. Be on the lookout, obviously, for more legislation around this, or at least more regulation around this. But for the time being, man, it is a tough space there with SIM swapping. Anyway, I wanted to make you aware of the risks, as well as certainly some of the things that you can do to protect yourself. Primarily, again, threat model, and then move to a voice over IP number for purely SMS based MFA. Thanks, Jake Williams, Rendition InfoSec, signing off.